Hi guys! So today we are going to get into the abnormal psychology behind DID and a little bit of history. The dynamics of DID through abnormal psychology are pretty important, and I'm doing some learning. This is basically an updated version of the DSM-5, and I will be reading what's in the book that I have sitting here, and we're gonna touch on a lot of really cool things today. So, number one here is defining abnormality. And it states here, the mental health community currently uses diagnostic procedures to decide on whether a given individual fits the criteria for abnormality. There are currently 5 criteria for a psychological disorder. The first is that of clinical significance, meaning that the behavior involves a measurable degree of impairment. The behavior must also have diagnostic fidelity, meaning that the diagnosis predict future behavior or responses to treatment. So basically what they're saying here is there's got to be an impairment of some sort that gives you issues in your daily life to meet a criteria, okay? Second, the behavior reflects a dysfunction in psychological, biological, or developmental processes. So basically they're saying you have to meet that criteria to continue on, okay? Third, the behavior usually is associated with significant distress or disability in important realms of life. So usually for this criteria, which relates to mine, is my DID and CPTSD has given me ailments not only mentally but physically that gives me issues in working or being able to have normal behavior, okay? Fourth, the individual's behavior cannot be socially deviant, as defined in terms of religion, politics, or sexuality. Okay. Fifth, conflicts between the individual and society are not counted as psychological disorders unless they reflect a dysfunction within the individual. Okay. When making diagnoses, clinicians not only evaluate each of these criteria, but also weigh the potential disadvantages of diagnosing behavior as abnormal versus providing a diagnosis that will permit the client to receive insurance coverage for the disturbance. Okay. So once you meet that criteria of abnormality, they move on to more abnormal behavior, what causes this behavior and why. And the 3 criteria that meet that are biological causes, physiological causes, and sociocultural causes, okay? And you can see here the little thing that defines all that, but I'm also going to read what I have here. Biological causes. The biological domain includes genetic and environmental influences on physical functioning. Particular interests are inherited factors that alter the functioning of the nervous system. Okay, so they're actually talking about like that vagus nerve issue. The behavior is causing a dysfunction in your body's work. So I have done a previous video on that, how like for me, I have fibromyalgia because of being in that hypertensive mode all the time to deal with my DID. So these are factors, okay? There are also physiological changes that affect behavior. So what they're saying here is, like for me, some of my physiological ailments can cause a lot of my switching or altercations in behavior, okay? And it states here, such as brain damage or exposure to harmful environmental stimuli. For example, a thyroid abnormality can cause a person's moods to fluctuate wildly, Brain damage resulting from a head trauma can result in altercation thought patterns. Toxic substances or allergens in the environment can also cause a person to experience disturbing emotional changes in behavior. Now, I also want you to keep in mind that this is also part of an assessment for your DID, because here's the thing. Let's say you have had brain trauma and it's causing dissociative symptoms, but it's not DID. So this is why it is so vital to have your mental health care professional to rule out other issues, okay? Because these can cause misdiagnoses, okay? Next is psychological causes. Psychological causes of abnormal behavior involve disturbances in thoughts and feelings. There are a variety of alternative explanations of abnormal behavior that focus on factors such as past learning experiences, maladaptive thought patterns, and difficulties coping with stress. Treatment models based on these theoretical perspectives reflect these varying assumptions. So what they're saying here is that they have to get a past history to understand the psychological causes for your DID. And sometimes that can be difficult, which is why assessments take so many years. Now, social cultural causes. The term social cultural refers to the various cycles of influence on the individual, ranging from close friend and family to the institutions and policies of a country or world as a whole. Discrimination, whether based on social class, income, race, and authenticity, or gender, can influence the development of abnormal behavior. For people who are diagnosed with a psychological disorder, social stigmas associated with being mental patients can further affect their symptoms. Now keep this in mind. I really want you to hear this out, because if you are not thoroughly assessed and per se your therapist just says, I think you have DID, you can't just go home and say, I've been diagnosed. No. You have to rule out all other factors, okay? And stigma is a huge issue with that, because it actually hurts people like me or others that have DID that are legitimately diagnosed, because you can misrepresent the disorder by just jumping in and saying, I got this and this is what happens and now I'm going to educate. It doesn't work that way. A stigma is a label that causes us to regard certain people as different, defective, and set apart from mainstream members of society. A stigma deters people from obtaining badly needed help, and therapy perpetrates a cycle in which many people in need become much worse. Okay? The stigma of psychological disorders affects people from ethnic and racial minorities more severely than those from mainstream society. So basically what they're saying here is that sometimes influence, I'll give an example, TikTok, influence by these little videos portraying DID can misrepresent somebody else's DID, because it's not being talked about thoroughly. It's just showing quick little skits and examples and cosplays, and some of them are very harmful, okay? So I want you to keep that in mind, these three factors, when you are working with your therapist. Talk to your therapist about these three factors. You're more than welcome to use this video as well to make sure to rule out all these issues. So next we are going to get into these three things here. One is spiritual explanations, 2 is humanitarian explanations, and 3 is the scientific explanations. So we're going to get a little bit of a history lesson here. So to start out with, we're going to talk about the biopsychosocial perspective, okay? Disturbances in any of these areas of human function can contribute to the development of a psychological disorder. However, we cannot so neatly divide the causes of abnormality. There is often considerable interaction among the three sets of influences. Okay? The biopsychosocial perspective incorporates a developmental viewpoint. This means that individuals must be seen as changing over time. Biosociological factors interact to alter the individual's expression of behavioral patterns over time. Thus, it is important to examine early risk factors that make an individual vulnerable to developing a disorder. Similarly, risk factors may vary according to the individual's position in the lifespan. The degree of influence of each of these variables differs from disorder to disorder. For some disorders, such as schizophrenia, biological plays a dominant role. For other disorders, such as stress reactions, psychological factors predominate. For other conditions, such as post-traumatic stress disorder, that result, for example, from experiences under a terrorist regime, the cause is primarily sociocultural. So what they're saying here is that you need to consider biosocial as an issue as well, because everybody that has DID is going to have different perspectives on what is going on with their alters, which is why I bring in again the trauma model therapy, because it basically is a psychotherapy that is based on your history, your physical issues, all that. So when you have alternative states, they can even have different perspective on things. So when a person is being treated for DID, there is one whole kind of thing where it's like CBT, DBT, EMDR, all that, but it also has to be formed around you yourself, okay? Now it continues on here. 3 prominent themes in explaining physiological disorders reoccur throughout history: the spiritual, the scientific, and the humanitarian. Spiritual explanations regard abnormal behavior as the product of possessions by evil or demonic spirits. Humanitarian explanations view the psychological disorders as the result of cruelty, stress, or poor living conditions. Scientific explanations look for causes that we can objectively measure, such as biological alterations, faulty learning processes, or emotional stressors. So I talk a little bit about that in my own past, how there are things in my life growing up as a free-range child, that things I've missed out on, such as social interaction before the age of 6. I didn't see much for children. We were raised on a farm, so everything we did seemed abnormal to normal children, even though it was normal for us. So these are things that can be a part of your history when you are being assessed. There are things and factors you can go back in time through your school records, if you can get them, where it'll show, like for me, my abnormal behavior, my fluctuating of my assessments to go into preschool were abnormal and it had to be reassessed. So these are things that could be factors in your DID. So next we're going to go into some history. We're going to touch the subject of spiritual approach on this, okay? The earliest approach to understanding abnormal behavior is spiritual. The belief that people showing signs of behavioral disturbance were possessed by evil spirits. Archaeological evidence dating back to 8000 BC suggests that the spiritual explanation was prevalent in prehistoric times. Skulls of the living had holes cut out of them, a process called trephining, apparently in an effort to release the evil spirits from a person's head. Wow. Archaeologists have found evidence of trephining from many countries and cultures, including the Far and Middle East. The Celtic tribes in Britain, ancient and recent China, India, and various people of North and South America, including the Mayans, Aztecs, Incas, and Brazilian Indians. And this was studied by Grass, 1999. Another ancient practice was to drive away evil spirits through the ritual of exorcism, a physically and mentally painful form of torture carried out by shaman, priests, or medicine man. Now this one's a more closer subject to me because I've dealt with some of this. During the Middle Ages, people widely practiced magical rituals and exorcisms and administered folk medicines. Society considered people with psychological difficulties sinners, witches, or embodiments of the devil, and they were punished severely. Okay? And it starts to go into like the Catholic aspect of things. 2 Dominican monks in Germany in 1486 became the church's justification for denouncing witches as heretics and devils whom it had to destroy in the interest of preserving Christianity. The church recommended treatments such as deportation, torture, and burning at the stake. Women were the main targets of persecution. Even in the late 1600s in colonial America, the Puritans sentenced women accused of witchcraft to death by hanging. I relate very close with this because I had gone through some ritualistic abuse. Sorry, speech impediment. And I want to bring in a little bit of my own history, theoretically speaking here. I have my family has been dated back to 1618. Mainly residing on my father's side from Sweden. And the reason we had relocated from Sweden to the US was because of the witch trials. And I have documentation of a prehistoric relative typing in old typewriting to my grandmother about my great Aunt Jacques, maybe even later than that, or earlier than that, of her being burned as a witch because of her issues. And it was quite interesting to find out, okay, so there's some past history that explains, okay, maybe there is some biological factors here in my DID, and that side of the family suffering from some mental health issues. And there's also more evidence in my family history, but we won't get into too much of that. But there's quite a bit of mental health disturbances, biological factors such as starvation, child abuse, physical abuse. There's many factors in my family history that my team has found to kind of put things together for me. So next we're going to touch on the humanitarian approach, and this talks about the asylums and the history of what people had been through, okay? The humanitarian approach developed throughout history in part as a reaction against the spiritual approach and its associated punishment of people with psychological disorders. Poorhouses and monasteries became shelters, and although they could not offer treatment, they provided some protective measures. Unfortunately, these often became overcrowded, and rather than providing protection for them, they became places where abuse occurred. For example, society widely believed that psychologically disturbed people were insensitive to extremes of heat and cold, or to the cleanliness of their own surroundings. Their treatment involved bleeding, forced vomiting, and purging. It took a few courageous people who recognized the inhumanity of the existing practices to bring about sweeping reforms. Now, I can highly relate to this because I can remember back then, now that my memory is becoming more and more aware of times where Sister Mary and our cult, it was an old Roman Catholic cult. If you want to know more, there is YouTube videos prior to this that talk about my history on that, but I'm going to keep this brief. Now, keep in mind, it talks about people were insensitive to extremes of heat and cold. Now, can you imagine somebody that has a psychological disorder such as mine, where heat and cold mess with the vagus nerve? The vagus nerve is what connects all your nerves in your body, okay? And because I have fibromyalgia, I have extreme hots and extreme colds in my fingers and feet. So can you imagine going through this with a dissociative disorder? It had to be so traumatizing. And then you add in like the treatment involving bleeding and forced vomiting and purging. Now, I never had the vomiting experience, but I have had called what you call bleeding the bat out, where they literally hurt you in sensitive areas to bleed out blood, to make basically a bad spirit go away. The other thing is the purging and the vomiting. Like I'd stated, I didn't deal with that, but I did deal with starvation, lack of water, lack of food to get a person more under control. And trust me, as soon as they do that, you are going to cooperate as best as you can so you don't have to go through it again. Anyway, continue on. Until the 1970s, despite the growing body of knowledge about the causes of abnormal behavior, the actual practices in the day-to-day care of sociologically disturbed people were sometimes as barbaric as those in the Middle Ages. Institutions restrained patients with powerful tranquilizing drugs and straitjackets, coats with sleeves long enough to wrap around the patient's torso. Even more radical was the indiscriminate use of behavior-altering brain surgeries or the application of electric shocks, so-called treatments that were punishments intended to control unruly patients. The federal government took empathetic action in 1963 with the passage of groundbreaking legislation. The Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Construction Act of that year initiated a series of changes that would affect mental health services for decades to come. So they're finally going, okay, this is not healthy, this is not good, we need to change this. And drugs were a big thing back then. I can also remember being given midazolam to knock me out, to control me. So, contemporary advocates of the humanitarian approach suggested new forms of compassionate treatment for people who suffer from psychological disorders. The advocates encouraged mental health consumers to take an active role in choosing their treatment. And that's something that we do today. We are allowed to be part of our treatment and to decide and help and use our therapist as a tool to guide us to get well. Various advocacy groups have worked tirelessly to change the way the public views mentally ill people and how society deals with them in all settings. These groups include the National Alliance for Mentally Ill, NAMI, as well as the Mental Health Association, the Center to Address Discrimination and Stigma, and the Eliminate the Barriers Initiative. Sorry. Well, every once in a while it just... So for a final thought on all this, I want to kind of get into the aspects of why assessments are so vital, and why it is important to understand things very carefully before approaching an educational stance on it. Don't get me wrong, you can talk about it, you can do videos on it, but I stick to the research and I stick to it very heavily because that is something I'm looking into doing more of, okay? So let's say your therapist says, I think you have depression, okay? And diagnosed you as such without the knowledge that you have not been sleeping. So you go in, you get your hour assessment, and she goes, I think you have depression. Yet without a history and more knowledge, she can say, I think you have it. It doesn't mean you're diagnosed with it, okay? Now keep in mind, you didn't mention you weren't sleeping. You didn't mention that you have all of a sudden sleep issues, okay? Not sleeping can cause depression, okay? So is the diagnosis really accurate, you know? Until the therapist has a thorough history, he or she won't know. So that is where a therapist must assess you to find out if it's depression or sleep deprivation, okay? And I'm reading off a piece of paper because I talk better when I write things down. It could also be environmental. So a bad bed, for example, could be causing your sleep disturbance. Simple as that, okay? Or new medication could be causing, sleep issues, okay? That is why it is essential to seek mental health care to help you, because you could watch a TikTok and all of a sudden go, I think I have depression. I show them signs, but that you're not putting in the other issues like sleep apnea or something else, you know. So in this part here, and you can see this little chart here, it has research methods in abnormal psychology. But first we're going to read this. Just knowing that there is a correlation between two variables, which is what I gave you, sleep disturbance / insomnia and depression, okay? does not tell you whether one variable causes the other. The correlation simply tells you that the two variables are associated with each other in a particular way. Sleep disturbance might cause a higher score on a measure of depression. Just as high a degree of depression might cause more disturbance sleep patterns. Or a third variable that you have not measured could account for the correlation between the two variables that you have studied. Both depression and sleep disturbance could be due to underlying physiological dysfunction. Investigators who use correlation methods in their research must always be on guard for the potential existence of unmeasured variables influencing the observed results. However, beyond simply linking two variables to see if they are correlated, researchers can use advanced methods that take more complex relationships into account. For example, we can assess the relative contributions of sleep disturbance, self-esteem, gender, and social class with correlation methods that evaluate several related variables at the same time. So per se, she says, I think you might have depression, but again, you have to do more studying into this person, know their history. May have to see a sleep specialist to have a sleep study done, etc. Excuse me. So in this table here, you'll see a survey, and it gives, for one, survey, laboratory study, case study, signal case, environmental design, and behavioral genetics. Excuse me. And these are examples of things that therapists need to do, or people that are looking into schooling on abnormal behaviors or abnormal psychology. And you can see there's quite a few things. Researchers work for a government agency, attempt to determine disease prevalence through questionnaires administered over telephone. So that the purpose, obtaining population data, okay? Then you have laboratory studies, collecting data under controlled conditions. An experiment is conducted to compare reactions to neutral and fear-provoked stimuli. So for me, I'm kind of a part of them studies where my therapist logs things that stimulate me for a trigger. Loud noises, bangs, populated areas, being in an unknown environment is a very difficult thing for me. Hence the reason I have some agoraphobic issues. Case study. An individual or small group of individuals is studied intensively. A therapist describes the cases of members of family who share the same unusual disorder. So that is why it is so vital for a therapist or mental health care professional to do a past history. In your history, it will show others that have suffered from mental illnesses. I've had some in the past diagnosed with schizophrenia. We still wonder if it wasn't, it could have been a dissociative issue. We don't know. But it shows in my past history mental illness, okay? Single case experimental design. The same person serves as subject in experimental controlled conditions. Researchers report on frequency of client's behavior while the client is given attention, experimental treatment, and ignored control condition for aggressive outbursts in psychiatric ward. And this is also done in some outpatient studies. Like for me, we find that bilateral music based on a particular alternative state's choice can stimulate an emotion for them to have to show me memories that I'm missing. It's a personal choice. Again, everybody's therapy is done differently. That works for me. It might work for you, it might not. It just depends. And also a factor is behavioral genetics. Attempt to identify genetic patterns in inheritance of particular behaviors. Genetic researchers compare the DNA of people with and without symptoms of particular psychological disorders. So that's another thing that's been brought into view lately is theoretically, my family has this ability to disassociate in ways that they don't feel pain. My mother is a prime example. She has high tolerance for pain. She went in and had all her molars pulled with no Novocaine. Somehow she's able to do that. But she doesn't have a dissociative disorder. She's able to disassociate from certain things, feelings. My mother does not cry. So these are examples of, is it a genetic thing? Well, according to Colin Ross, no. But then there's these factors that, okay, could I as a child picked up some of these mannerisms from my mother? Yeah. So anyway, I hope you found this to be an interesting subject. I sure did, and I'll be digging more into some of this stuff because I'm looking at continuing my schooling. So that's all I have today, guys. Loves. Bye.